Welcome back to Inside Criminology, where we break down the theories, data, and realities behind crime and justice. I'm your host, and in this deep dive, we explore Chapter 2 of Larry J. Siegel's Criminology, diving into key criminological theories and the patterns that shape our understanding of crime.
Yeah, and it's quite a chapter. We're looking at everything from classical deterrence to sociological insights, and from crime data all the way to chronic offenders.
Exactly. Let's unpack what drives crime and maybe more importantly, how we even study it.
It's a fantastic chapter for getting that foundational look at the field.
Yeah.
And as we dig into this material you've shared, one of the first things that jumps out are these really big theoretical ideas trying to explain why crime happens.
Right, the source gives us a snapshot of a few major ones, like arguably the most fundamental idea going back centuries, this notion that committing crime is simply a rational choice.
Exactly. That's the core of classical theory, which really took shape around 1764 with thinkers like Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham. The idea is pretty straightforward. People weigh the potential benefits of a crime against the potential costs.
So if the payoff looks good enough compared to the risk,
They do it. If not, they don't. And the implication for preventing crime is, well, deterrence, making the costs, specifically the punishment, certain, severe, and swift enough to, tip that scale against committing the crime.
it's that image of the calculating criminal, isn't it? Which is totally different from another major theory mentioned, conflict theory.
Conflict theory, yeah, it comes much later, emerging around 1848,
Mm.
tied to thinkers like Karl Marx. The core idea here is that crime isn't just about individual choices. It's fundamentally a function of class struggle within a capitalist system.
So, like, crime is almost baked into a system built on competition and inequality. Is that the idea?
That's the perspective. It sees the law and the justice system as tools, basically, used by the powerful to maintain their position and control those lower down the ladder. The source points out this has led to modern variations like radical theory and feminist theory, looking at power imbalances based on class, gender, race, and so on.
Okay, so you have rational choice on one side, systemic inequality on the other. Then the source also touches on developmental, life course, and latent trait theories. These sound more focused on the individual's journey.
They really are. These theories take a longer view, looking at how factors throughout a person's life influence their likelihood of, engaging in crime. The idea, linked to earlier thinkers like Durkheim and Shaw, but more recently developed, is that criminal behavior is a function of complex environmental, social, physical, and psychological factors interacting over time.
So it's about, like, deficits in development increasing risks, things going wrong along the way.
Yeah, things like poor socialization, maybe growing up in a really difficult environment, or specific psychological traits can increase the risk. But importantly, these theories also suggest that strengthening positive traits and conditions can help people resist crime. They really examine the pathway into and potentially out of criminal behavior over a whole lifetime.
Okay, so those give us some frameworks for why crime might happen. But to understand it empirically, criminologists need data. How do they actually go about studying crime and collecting that information?
Right, this is where the source dives into methodology, and they use a whole toolbox of techniques, really.
But like survey research, which seems pretty direct, just ask people.
It is, in a way, asking people about their attitudes, beliefs, values, or even their own behavior. This includes self-report surveys, where people admit to their own criminal acts, often things that never got reported.
Okay. Getting at that hidden crime.
Exactly. And then victimization surveys, asking people if they've been victims of crime.
I can imagine self-report surveys have some challenges, though, trusting people to be honest about illegal stuff.
Absolutely. Anonymity is crucial, but validity is always a big question mark. You have to be careful. Victimization surveys also rely on memory and, people's willingness to share what might be difficult experiences.
What about watching groups over time? That sounds different.
That's cohort research. Following a specific group, say everyone born in a certain year in a certain city, over many years, that's longitudinal, or sometimes looking back at their lives retrospectively. This has been incredibly important for understanding criminal careers, how offending starts, continues, or maybe stops.
And the source highlights Marvin Wolfgang's pioneering work here, right?
Yes, his cohort studies were truly groundbreaking, particularly in identifying the chronic offender, which is a concept we'll definitely circle back to. It's huge.
Okay, so beyond surveys and cohorts, they also use official record research.
Right, pulling data directly from police reports, court records, and experimental research is listed too, though it's not detailed much in this particular chapter.
And what about getting beyond just the numbers, like looking at individual stories or contexts?
That's where observational and interview research comes in. The source gives a great example. Claire Stark Ellison's interviews with middle-class female drug abusers. These methods capture really rich, nuanced insights you just can't get from, say, a large-scale survey.
Getting a deeper feel for specific experiences.
Exactly. And finally, to sort of make sense of all the individual studies out there, they use meta-analysis and systematic review, basically combining findings from lots of studies to see the bigger picture. The source mentions the work by Farrington and Welsh on street lighting.
Oh, that was the surprising finding, wasn't it? They looked at studies on improved street lighting and found it reduced crime. But even during the day, that seems odd.
It is fascinating, exactly that counterintuitive result.
Yeah.
Because if it were just about visibility, you'd only expect an impact at night, right? Their findings suggested it might be something else going on, maybe increasing community pride or what they call collective efficacy, making residents feel safer, more invested, more likely to look out for their neighborhood, which could deter crime around the clock.
Wow, that really shows how looking across different studies can reveal something unexpected. So, with all these methods, how do we actually get a picture of crime across the whole country? What are the big data sources?
Okay, that brings us to the major sources of national crime data in the U.S. And it's crucial to understand that each one is trying to measure the scale of crime, but each also comes with significant limitations.
The one most people probably know is the Uniform Crime Report, the UCR.
Yes, the UCR. It's compiled by the FBI using data voluntarily submitted by thousands of police departments across the country. It mainly focuses on the most serious offenses, known as index crimes or Part I crimes.
Right, the big ones like murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, arson.
Exactly those. The data comes from crimes reported to the police, arrests made, and clearances, which is when a crime is considered solved, usually by an arrest. You tend to see higher clearance rates for violent crimes than for property crimes. The UCR presents this data in a few ways. Raw numbers as a rate per 100,000 people.
Which helps compare, like, big cities and small towns.
Right. And it shows changes over time.
So it's the official count of crimes the police know about. But based on the source, maybe the biggest story about the UCR is its problems with accuracy.
Crucially, yes. This is perhaps the single most important thing to grasp about the UCR. It significantly underestimates the true extent of crime. Why? Well, there are several layers of validity issues, things that affect how accurate it is.
Well, like the fact that many crimes aren't even reported by victims in the first place, that seems huge.
That's the first major hurdle, reporting practices. Surveys, like the victimization surveys we mentioned, suggest maybe less than 40% of incidents are actually reported to the police. Think about it if you have a minor theft, or maybe an assault by someone you know, or you don't trust the police, or you don't have insurance to make a claim.
Yeah, lots of reasons not to call.
Exactly. So you might not report it. This means a massive chunk of crime, what criminologists call the dark figure of crime, never even makes it into the UCR data.
Okay, that makes sense. What about how the police themselves handle the data they do get?
That's the next layer. Law enforcement practices. How police departments record and categorize crimes can vary. There have been historical examples and even more recent audits suggesting numbers can be accidentally skewed by just systemic errors or sometimes even deliberately manipulated, perhaps to make a city or department look safer than it is.
Oh.
And ironically, increased police efficiency or professionalism can sometimes actually increase the reported rates because the public might become more willing to report crimes or the police get better at recording them.
Huh. So getting better at policing could actually make the official crime stats look worse, at least initially. That's counterintuitive.
It potentially could, yeah. And then there are methodological issues baked into how the UCR itself is structured. It doesn't typically include federal crimes. Reporting by agencies is voluntary, so not everyone participates, or they might send incomplete data. There's estimation involved. And a really big one is the hierarchy rule.
Remind me, what's the hierarchy rule again?
Okay, so if multiple crimes happen in a single incident, say, someone breaks in, assaults the resident, robs them, and steals their car under the hierarchy rule, only the most serious offense, probably the robbery in that case, gets counted in the main UCR index crime tally.
So it hides all the other crimes that happened in that same event.
It does. It undercounts the total volume of criminal activity. Also, specific definitions of crimes, or how things like attempted versus completed acts are counted, can differ slightly from state laws or agency practices.
That's a lot of potential for the UCR to miss or misrepresent what's really happening out there. Is there a better system coming online?
The source points to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS, as the future direction. It's designed to capture much more detailed information about each crime incident, details about the victim, the offender, the circumstances, property involved, and it covers a much wider range of offenses, not just the top 8. The goal is greater accuracy and uniformity, getting rid of that hierarchy rule, but it's a massive undertaking and it's still being implemented state by state.
So NIBRS is aiming to fix some of those UCR problems. But what about capturing all that crime that victims don't report to the police at all? The dark figure.
That's the primary job of victim surveys, particularly the big one, the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS. It's a large nationwide survey where they ask people directly about their experiences as victims of crime, whether they reported it to the police or not.
So its big strength is capturing that dark figure that the UCR completely misses.
Absolutely. It includes crimes not reported to police. It uses careful sampling methods to try and be representative, and it's conducted annually. It provides really valuable insights into victim characteristics, risk factors, where and when crimes tend to occur, things the UCR often doesn't capture well.
But it's not perfect either, I'm guessing.
No measurement tool is. The NCVS relies heavily on victims accurately remembering and reporting events, which can be difficult, especially for traumatic incidents or things that happened a while ago. It also misses some types of crime entirely, like murder. Obviously, the victim can't report. And typically, victimless crimes like drug abuse aren't captured well. There can be sampling errors, just like in any survey, and how questions are phrased can influence the answers. Plus, it generally doesn't survey people living in institutions like prisons or nursing homes.
Okay, so UCR, the official police count, misses a lot, has reporting and methodological issues. NCVS captures unreported crime from victims, but relies on memory and misses certain types. What's the third main source of crime data mentioned?
That would be self-report surveys. These involve asking individuals, often anonymously, about their own delinquent or criminal behavior. They're frequently done with young people, maybe in school settings, because it's a convenient way to get a cross-section of the community, and juvenile crime rates are high.
Ah, okay, getting the story directly from the potential offenders themselves this time.
Right. These are particularly useful for trying to uncover those less serious or less visible crimes that are very rarely reported to police or even captured well by victim surveys, things like minor thefts, vandalism, underage drinking, drug use. They can also gather information on offenders' attitudes, values, beliefs, maybe even psychological profiles.
But again, you're asking people to admit to doing illegal things. Honesty has got to be the big question mark here, too.
That's definitely their biggest weakness. Reliability depends heavily on the honesty of the respondents. And who are you not reaching with these surveys? Often it might be the most serious chronic offenders. They might be incarcerated, dropped out of school, or simply refuse to participate or lie if they do.
So the surveys might miss the worst offenders.
That's a real concern, the missing cases phenomenon. The surveys might also pick up a lot of very minor, maybe even trivial offenses, which can sometimes inflate the perception of how widespread delinquency is. Research cited suggests the most serious offenders are often the least likely to participate accurately. Still, despite limitations, they're considered a standard measure for things like youth drug use.
So UCR, NCVS, self-reports. 3 different lenses, each with its own blind spots and biases. Do they end up painting totally different pictures of crime, or is there some overlap?
Well, what's interesting, and perhaps a bit reassuring, is that while they definitely give different numbers for the total amount of crime out there, the source concludes they tend to agree more on the general nature and patterns of criminal behavior.
Like who is most likely to be an offender or a victim,
Yeah.
or when and where crime happens.
Exactly. On those kinds of relative patterns, the different sources often show similar trends, even if the absolute numbers vary quite a bit.
That consistency in the patterns is key then. Let's actually look at those patterns, starting with crime trends over time in the U.S. What does the historical data from the source show us? Any broad strokes?
It shows really significant fluctuations over the long haul. The source mentions crime increasing from the 1830s to the 1860s, then a sharp jump after the Civil War, followed by a general decline from the 1880s through World War I and the Depression, though it picked up again in the 1930s.
And then came the big post-World War II rise that people often talk about.
Exactly. Crime rates increased gradually from the 30s, but then saw a much, much steeper rise through the 1960s and 70s. Things sort of peaked around 1980, dipped a bit, and then hit another major peak around 1991.
That 1991 peak feels like the high watermark many people remember from news headlines and stuff. What's happened since then, according to the source?
A pretty significant decline, actually. The source notes a substantial downward trend in overall crime rates, including violent crime, starting from that 1991 peak and continuing through at least 2003, which is the period covered here. Even juvenile crime dropped considerably during that time.
What about homicide rates? They're often seen as the most reliable statistic in the UCR because, well, a death is hard to miss. Do they show a similar pattern?
Yes, similar, though maybe slightly different timing on the peaks.
Yeah.
Homicide peaked way back around 1930, was fairly stable for a while after WWII, then rose sharply through the 70s, peaking in 1980 about 10.2 murders per 100,000 people. It fluctuated a bit, hit another high peak around 1991, over 24,000 murders that year, and then saw a really dramatic decline by the year 2000, down to 5.7 per 100,000.
Wow, that's a huge drop in murders in just a decade.
Over 40% drop, yeah. It was significant. However, the source does note a slight uptick in murders between 2002 and 2003, partly linked to increases in gang violence, which raised the question back then of whether that long decline might be ending.
Predicting crime trends is clearly really difficult. What factors do experts point to as influencing these big ups and downs? The source lists quite a few, emphasizing how complex and debated it all is.
Oh, it's definitely not a single cause, that's for sure. Age structure is a big one. Since young males commit a disproportionate amount of crime, the sheer number or proportion of young people in the population matters a lot. A graying society, with more elderly folks, could potentially offset crime increases, even if the youth population booms a bit. Experts like James A. Fox and Stephen Levitt have had differing predictions over the years based on these kinds of demographic shifts.
The economy is another one that seems intuitive, right? Bad times, more crime.
You'd think, but it's actually debated. Some argue a poor economy directly drives theft and property crime. Others argue it might decrease crime because more parents are home supervising kids, and there are fewer valuable targets out and about. The source seems to lean towards the long-term view that strong economies often correlate with lower crime, citing the high crime of the Depression in the 1930s and the low crime of the booming 1990s as examples.
What about social malaise? That sounds kind of vague.
It refers to the idea that increases in broader social problems, things like more single-parent families, higher school dropout rates, racial conflict, maybe teen pregnancies tend to correlate with higher crime rates. Conversely, when things like teen birth rates started to decline, that was later linked to drops in crime. It's about the general health, or lack thereof, of the social fabric.
And the influence of media, especially violent media, that's a debate that never seems to end.
It really doesn't. The source cites research, like studies by Bushman and Anderson, suggesting there's a correlation between watching violent media and aggressive behavior, particularly for individuals who might already be predisposed to aggression. Another study by Jeffrey Johnson found a link between how much TV teenage boys watched and their likelihood of getting into fights or committing violence later as adults. Still highly debated, though.
Now, there was a really interesting point in the source about medical technology. How does that affect crime rates?
This one is fascinating. Anthony Harris put forward the argument that advancements in trauma care, think about the medical techniques honed during wars like Vietnam, have meant that many people who were victims of serious assaults survive today, whereas decades ago they might have died.
Ah, so assaults that would have been murders in the past are now classified as aggravated assaults.
Exactly. He suggests this is a major reason why the aggravated assault rate has grown much faster than the murder rate over time. Medical science might literally be preventing thousands of deaths each year, which keeps the official murder rate lower than it might otherwise be.
That's a surprising factor influencing crime statistics. What about justice policy itself? Things like policing and prisons.
Yeah, the source discusses things like increased police presence, maybe more aggressive policing tactics, targeting minor quality-of-life offenses. The idea that this could deter more serious crime. Also, tougher sentencing laws, mandatory prison terms, especially for drug dealers or repeat offenders. These could potentially inhibit crime by incapacitating high-rate offenders, just taking them off the streets. The source explicitly notes the parallel between the massive increase in the U.S. prison population over recent decades and the significant decline in crime rates during much of that same period. Correlation isn't causation, but the link is there.
Gangs were mentioned earlier with the recent uptick in homicides around 2003.
Yes, the source highlights the significant role of teenage gangs, especially their explosive growth and involvement in the drug trade, often recruiting younger members. Gang membership frequently correlates with increased criminal activity and gun possession.
And drug use itself, beyond just the gangs.
The crack cocaine epidemic is presented as a really clear example. The surge in violent crime in the 1980s and early 1990s is heavily linked by many researchers to the violence associated with the crack trade dealers fighting over turf, users committing crimes to get money. As that specific epidemic subsided, some of that associated violence decreased. Conversely, the source notes, a sudden increase in drug use could be seen as a potential warning sign, a harbinger of future crime increases.
Okay, and finally, the source mentions crime opportunities. What does that mean?
Basically, changes in the market for stolen goods or the availability of alternative criminal opportunities can shift crime patterns. The source suggests, for instance, that the decline in burglary might be partly because common targets like TVs or cameras became much cheaper and more abundant, making them less appealing to steal, alongside better home security systems. This might shift criminal activity towards less counted types of crime, like maybe theft from cars or identity theft.
It's really clear there's no single switch you can flip to control crime. It's this incredibly complex interaction of demographics, the economy, social factors, technology, government policies, gangs, drugs, and even just the opportunities available.
Exactly. And the source makes a good point that the factors influencing U.S. crime trends might not apply universally. It notes that during the period covered, crime was generally declining in the U.S., while it was actually increasing in parts of Europe, suggesting different dynamics might be at play globally.
Let's drill down now into how crime is distributed not just over time, but across space and time, what the source calls the ecology of crime.
Right. This looks at patterns linked to the physical environment and timing, things like day, season, and climate, for instance.
Summer is often seen as a peak crime season, right? More people out and about.
The data generally supports that UCR shows most reported crimes happen in the warmer summer months, July and August, typically being highest. This is often linked to exactly what you said. More people are outdoors, easier targets maybe, homes might be vacant for vacations, and crucially, teenagers are out of school.
Makes sense.
However, not all crimes follow this pattern strictly. Some serious crimes like murder and robbery can actually occur frequently in the winter months too. Temperature itself seems to play a role, with some studies finding links between hotter temperatures and higher assault rates, although the relationship might be complex, maybe like an inverted U-shaped crime increases with heat up to a point, then might decrease if it gets too hot.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What about regional differences within the country?
There are pretty consistent patterns here too. Large urban areas consistently have higher violent crime rates than suburban or rural areas. The source briefly mentions the Southern subculture of violence theory as one attempt to explain why the Southern U.S. historically has had higher rates of interpersonal violence, suggesting cultural factors beyond just economic ones, though this is a debated theory.
And one of the most significant factors in the ecology of crime, almost inescapable in discussions today, is the role of firearms.
Absolutely. Data from both the NCVS victim surveys and the UCR police reports consistently show firearms are involved in a very high percentage of violent crimes, particularly murder and robbery. The source states about 2/3 of all murders involve firearms, and handguns are the weapon used most often in those cases.
This leads directly into that significant and often really contentious policy debate around gun control, which the source presents by, it seems, laying out arguments and research findings from different sides pretty neutrally.
It does try to present both sides based on the cited research. The argument for control often emphasizes the sheer number of guns in private hands in the U.S. compared to other developed nations, and points to the statistical link between handguns and violent deaths, including deaths of police officers. Research cited, like meta-analyses by Hepburn and Hemingway, suggest that greater firearm availability is associated with higher homicide rates and that having guns in the household might increase risk rather than providing protection.
So that side points to research showing a correlation, at least, between more guns and more violence. What's the core argument against more gun control?
This side typically emphasizes individual liberty and the Second Amendment right to bear arms. The argument is often that the focus should be on punishing criminals who misuse guns, not restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens. Surveys mentioned suggest gun owners may have higher levels of distrust in government and view gun ownership as a symbol of freedom and personal empowerment.
There have been various federal and state gun control efforts over the years. How effective has the research cited found them to be? It sounds like mixed results.
That's a fair summary, based on the source, yeah. Laws like the Federal Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act added background checks and waiting periods. Some studies cited, like one by Ludwig and Cook, found little evidence that the Brady Law itself significantly reduced homicide rates, though others might disagree. State laws also show mixed results. Massachusetts implemented a mandatory prison sentence for carrying a handgun without a permit, the Bartley-Fox law. Handgun use in robberies and murders reportedly decreased, but use of other weapons increased, and similar crime drops were seen in comparable cities without such strict laws. California's 1020 life law adds substantial prison time specifically for using a gun during felonies.
So the impact of these specific policies is far from universally agreed upon in the research literature presented, and trying to completely eliminate guns or even just control their flow seems incredibly difficult logistically.
The source points out major challenges there. The huge volume of private gun sales that often bypass regulations, gun shows which sometimes have fewer restrictions, other unauthorized sources, and the issue of straw purchasers, people who buy guns legally for others who cannot. Even with strict laws on the books, the illegal market poses a massive challenge.
Okay, what about the argument that guns are necessary, or at least useful, for self-defense? That's a common point made against controls.
It is, and the source presents this perspective too. Criminologist Gary Kleik is cited for his extensive research, arguing that guns are used defensively far more often than criminally, and that they can help potential victims escape injury, de-escalate situations without even firing a shot, and potentially deter attackers just by being present. His research suggested that gun owners, as a group, were only slightly more likely to commit homicide than non-owners, leading him to conclude that the defensive benefits might outweigh the societal costs.
But there's research presented that pushes back on that conclusion, too.
Yes. Other studies cited, like one by Kovanzic and Marvell, found that state right-to-carry laws allowing more citizens to carry concealed weapons had little overall effect on crime rates, neither increasing nor decreasing them significantly. Other research suggests that documented cases of defensive gun use might be limited compared to criminal use, and that having a gun readily available during a violent confrontation is statistically more likely to result in a negative outcome, like the gun being used against the owner or escalating the violence, compared to using other means of defense or no weapon at all.
It's really clear, just from this summary, that this is a deeply complex issue with conflicting research findings and very strong beliefs on both sides. The source seems to just lay out the different viewpoints and research findings impartially.
Absolutely. And it's a perfect example of how interpreting research findings in criminology can be really tangled up with broader social values and political context. There's data supporting very different policy conclusions.
Okay, moving from the specific issue of guns to broader demographics, let's tackle the long-standing and often tricky debate about social class and crime. The source calls this relationship unresolved. Why is that?
Well, it really is. The traditional view, which seems supported by official data like the UCR and surveys of people in prison, is that crime is primarily a lower-class phenomenon, the thinking goes. Poverty creates an incentive for instrumental crime, like theft, to get resources. And maybe the frustration and stress of poverty fuels expressive crime, like violence. Official stats do show higher crime rates reported in poorer areas, and prisons are disproportionately filled with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or who are unemployed.
Okay, so the official numbers seem to point one way, but there's an alternative explanation that pushes back hard on that interpretation, right?
Heavily. This alternative view argues that the link we see in official data isn't necessarily because lower-class people commit more crime, but because of how the justice system operates. The argument is that police might focus more resources and patrols in low-income neighborhoods, leading to more arrests there just because of higher surveillance.
So more scrutiny leads to more recorded crime.
That's part of it. And also there's the idea of differential treatment, that police might be more likely to formally arrest and charge a lower-class suspect compared to a middle or upper-class suspect for the exact same behavior, maybe letting the wealthier person off with a warning.
And self-report studies where people are asked about their own behavior seem to complicate this picture even more.
They really do. Especially early self-report studies often found very little relationship between social class and minor delinquency rates. When you ask kids themselves, poor kids didn't report committing significantly more minor offenses than wealthier kids. This finding was used to strongly support the police bias argument, suggesting the official stats were skewed by who gets caught and processed.
What about more recent self-report studies? Do they show the same thing?
It's still complex. Some more recent, maybe more sophisticated, national self-report studies might still find relatively similar rates of committing delinquent acts between different class groups, especially for less serious stuff. But they also sometimes find that minority youths, who are disproportionately likely to be lower class, are arrested and formally processed more often, even when their self-reported offending rates aren't dramatically higher.
So the class crime controversy, as the source calls it, is partly about this puzzle. Are we seeing real differences in behavior, or are we mostly seeing the impact of how we measure crime and how the justice system responds?
Exactly. That's the core of the debate. And adding another layer of complexity is the fact that different studies measure social class in different ways: income, education, occupation, neighborhood characteristics, which makes comparing findings tricky. Some measures of class seem only weakly related to crime, while others, like
Hmm.
maybe unemployment or reliance on welfare, might show stronger links in some studies.
So what's the bottom line from the source on does class matter? Does it lean one way or the other?
The source suggests that recent evidence indicates that serious official crime, the kind that lands people in prison, especially violent crime, does appear to be more prevalent among the lower classes. Factors like income inequality, poverty, and socioeconomic deprivation are linked in research to higher rates of serious violent crimes like homicide. It also notes that individuals in lower socioeconomic strata may face higher rates of certain psychological issues like anxiety or conduct disorders that could contribute to criminality. And lack of legitimate opportunity can certainly fuel frustration and what's called relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation. That's feeling poor compared to the people right around you, even if you're not objectively destitute in a global sense.
Yes, exactly. It's the feeling of being unfairly left behind compared to your immediate social context, which can breed resentment. The source also mentions findings suggesting things like family disruption are more common in contexts of poverty, and that welfare programs have sometimes been linked to decreases in crime rates, possibly by easing economic strain. However, it's careful to acknowledge that poverty alone doesn't explain everything, especially not chronic violent offenders. And if class and crime aren't strongly related for less serious offending, then the causes must lie in factors that cut across classes, things like psychological issues, family conflict, peer pressure, school failure, which the source indicates will be discussed in later chapters.
Okay, moving from class, which is clearly complex, to age and crime. This seems much less controversial according to the source.
Much less, yes. There's broad agreement in criminology on this point. Age is inversely related to criminality. Simply put, younger people commit crime far more often than older people. And this pattern has been incredibly stable over time, looking back decades.
The official statistics cited are pretty stark here, aren't they?
They really are. Youths aged roughly 13 to 17 make up a relatively small percentage of the total population, maybe 6% in the source's example. But they account for a hugely disproportionate share of arrests for serious index crimes, maybe 25%, and a significant chunk of all arrests. The peak age for arrests for property crime is around 16, and for violent crime it's around 18,
And then it drops off quickly.
dramatically. As you move into older age groups, involvement in crime just plummets. Adults over 45, who are a large segment of the population, maybe 32%, account for only a tiny fraction of serious crime arrests, like 7%. And the elderly, say 65 plus star, have extremely low crime rates, mostly minor offenses like larceny or alcohol-related incidents, and their crime rate has been stable.
This whole phenomenon is widely known as aging out of crime or desistance.
Exactly. Crime participation tends to peak in adolescence or early adulthood, and then declines rapidly for most people. Criminologist Robert Agnew offers an explanation linking this peak specifically to the unique nature and pressures of adolescence in modern societies. You have reduced parental supervision, but increased demands from peers and society. You have a larger, more influential peer world. You desire adult privileges like money and status, but often lack the legitimate means to get them. Maybe you have reduced ability to cope with stress legitimately, and you might be more impatient, focused on immediate rewards rather than long-term consequences. All this combines to make adolescence a high-risk period.
James Q. Wilson and Richard Herrnstein also saw it as just a natural part of the human life cycle too, right?
Yes, their view complements Agnew's. They argued that adolescence is fueled by strong biological urges, the need for money and sex, reinforcement from peers, a desire for independence from parents, plus just youthful energy and physical strength. As people mature into adulthood, they typically develop a greater ability to delay gratification, they desire responsibility, they adhere more to conventional social norms, and crucially, they establish stable relationships, get married, start families, things that research consistently links to stopping criminal behavior or desisting.
But the source notes a really crucial distinction here, one that challenges the idea that everyone just naturally ages out equally.
This is key, and it ties directly into the concept of the chronic offender we'll discuss shortly. While it's true that most people, especially those involved in less serious offending, do age out of crime, a smaller but significant group doesn't. They continue offending persistently into adulthood. This strongly suggests there might be different types of offenders, maybe those whose delinquency is really just limited to their adolescence and then stops, and another group whose antisocial behavior starts early and persists throughout life.
That difference is fundamental. Okay, that leads us right into gender and crime. The source notes, unsurprisingly perhaps, a very clear gender gap in crime rates.
Yeah, that's one of the most consistent findings in criminology, across time and cultures. Men commit significantly more crime than women, especially serious and violent crime. Explaining this persistent difference has involved looking at several perspectives over the years.
Some of the really early explanations sound pretty outdated now based on the source.
Oh, very much so. Early ideas like Lombroso's masculinity hypothesis from the 19th century, suggesting female criminals lacked typical feminine traits like piety and maternity, are really not taken seriously today at all. However, the source does mention that some current criminologists still explore potential biological or hormonal influences, sometimes linking male hormones like androgens or testosterone to higher levels of aggression, which could partly explain gender differences in violent crime. But that's just one small part of the picture.
The focus seems much more heavily on socialization and development as explanations.
That's definitely where a lot of the focus lies. The argument is that girls and boys are typically socialized very differently from a very young age. Girls are often encouraged to avoid violence and aggression. They might be supervised more closely by parents, and they're often taught moral values that emphasize relationships and discourage antisocial behavior more strongly than boys are.
The source also mentions cognitive and empathy differences.
Yes, it notes some observed average differences, girls often showing superior verbal skills, boys visual spatial skills, though it cautions these are often linked to cultural expectations and can narrow with training. Differences in empathy are also highlighted, with studies suggesting girls, on average, tend to be more empathetic, perhaps making them better able to understand a potential victim's suffering, and thus less likely to inflict harm.
And how they're taught to handle conflict differs, too.
Right. Socialization influences how genders learn to react to provocation or anger. Boys might be encouraged, or at least permitted, to retaliate physically, while girls might be taught to respond with anxiety, depression, or self-blame, often to avoid harming relationships. Aggression itself often appears differently early on, boys showing more overt physical aggression, girls perhaps more relational aggression like social exclusion or gossip. Females might be more likely to feel distressed by their own anger and fear harming relationships, while males might react with more moral outrage and blame others.
And psychologist Sandra Bem's gender schema theory is brought in here as well. What's that about?
Bem's theory suggests that society creates these strongly polarized concepts of masculine and feminine, with distinct roles, scripts, and traits associated with each. Children learn these schemas early on and internalize them, actively seeking information that helps them define themselves and behave according to these gendered expectations. Applied to crime, some developmental views might suggest that the relatively few girls who do commit serious crime might be those who, for various reasons, have socialized differently and identify more with traditionally masculine traits like dominance or forcefulness.
Now, feminist theories also offered distinct explanations for the gender gap, particularly in the 1970s.
Yes, liberal feminist theory, emerging in the 70s, proposed a different angle. It argued that the historically lower female crime rates weren't due to inherent traits, but because women occupied a second-class social and economic position with fewer opportunities, including fewer opportunities for crime. They predicted that as women gained more equality, moved into the workforce, and took on roles more similar to men's, their crime rates would start to converge with men's rates.
Was there evidence for that convergence? People talked about the new female criminal back then?
There was some discussion, yeah. Female arrest rates did increase noticeably in the 1960s and 70s, especially for property crimes like burglary and larceny, which were traditionally seen as male crimes. This led to talk of this new female criminal. Some self-report studies from that era also seem to support the idea, finding that the patterns of offending and the risk factors for delinquency were becoming more similar for boys and girls. These perspectives often linked female criminality strongly to economic issues and changing gender roles.
So the prediction was basically equality equals more female crime. Was that the concern?
That was certainly a concern raised by some observers based on that theory. However, the source notes there's an ongoing debate about, is convergence likely? Many criminologists argue that despite those earlier increases, the gender gap in serious crime remains very significant.
Why wouldn't the rates converge if roles became more similar?
Well, some argue that the emancipation or liberation movement had less impact on the types of women who are most likely to become serious offenders, suggesting these women often come from socioeconomic classes that were least affected by the mainstream women's movement, and their crime is more closely tied to persistent economic hardship and deprivation, not newfound opportunities.
And the patterns of crime committed by men and women still differ significantly.
Yes, that's a key point. Men continue to commit a vastly disproportionate share of serious violent crimes and major property crimes. While research confirms that factors like poverty definitely increase the likelihood of serious offending for women, the overall patterns of male and female criminality remain quite distinct. Critical criminologists offer another perspective, linking persistent gender differences in crime to broader power inequalities within capitalist society and the specific ways females can be exploited. So the source's conclusion seems to be that while female crime patterns have changed somewhat, significant gender-based differences in crime rates, especially for serious offenses, persist.
Okay, let's turn now to another really sensitive and complex area, race and crime. The official data, like the UCR, shows pretty distinct racial patterns.
Very much so, and is a major point of discussion and concern. Official statistics, like the UCR arrest data cited, consistently indicate that African Americans, who make up about 12–13% of the U.S. population, account for a disproportionately high percentage of arrests for serious violent crimes, like 38% in the example, and property crimes, around 30%, as well as many other Part 2 offenses except maybe alcohol violations.
And just like with the class debate, the absolute core question here is, does this disparity in official statistics reflect actual differences in the amount or type of crime committed by different racial groups? Or is it primarily the result of biases within the justice system or flaws in how the data is collected?
That is precisely the central tension. And again, comparing official data with self-report studies becomes crucial for trying to untangle this. Early self-report studies, going back decades, often found minimal racial differences in self-reported delinquency, especially for less serious offenses among youth. This finding was seen as strong evidence supporting the hypothesis that the disparities in official arrest data were largely due to police bias in deciding who to stop, question, and formally arrest.
What about more recent self-report studies? Do they tell the same story?
The picture from more recent national studies is maybe a bit more nuanced, but still points towards system bias playing a significant role. These studies might find somewhat more similar rates of committing delinquent acts between black and white teens compared to the huge disparities in arrest rates. But importantly, they also often find that black youths are still more likely to be arrested and taken into formal custody by police, even when their self-reported offending levels are similar to white youths. This reinforces the suggestion of differential selection or processing by law enforcement.
So, even if offending rates are closer than arrest rates suggest, the official stats might still be significantly skewed by policing practices.
That's a key argument presented very clearly in the source. It outlines several potential explanations for the racial disparities we see in official data. One major factor discussed is police bias and the potential for racial profiling.
Meaning police targeting minorities unfairly.
Right. The source cites research suggesting that suspects who are poor, minority, and male are statistically more likely to be formally arrested by police than suspects who are white, more affluent, or female, even for similar conduct. Critics charge that police sometimes use racial profiling, stopping or questioning individuals based on their race or ethnicity without sufficient probable cause. A national survey mention found that young black and Latino males reported being stopped, cited, searched, and targeted for police force more often than young white males, even though they weren't found to be more likely to actually possess contraband when searched. This is where terms like DWB, or driving while black, entered the popular lexicon, reflecting this perceived reality for many.
This points beyond individual officer bias to potentially more systemic issues, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The source discusses institutional racism as another significant factor. This perspective argues that racism isn't just individual prejudice, but can be embedded within the structures and operations of institutions, including the justice system, in ways that systematically disadvantage minority groups.
How might that manifest?
Well, the source cites empirical evidence suggesting harsher treatment for young African-American males at various points in the justice system process. There's evidence cited indicating potentially longer prison sentences for unemployed African-Americans compared to similarly situated whites, possibly reflecting a perception of them as social dynamite or a greater threat. It also notes that African American victims of crime often receive less public attention and media coverage than white victims. The source brings in Jerome Miller's argument about how police abuse of authority can saddle young African American males with criminal records early on, contrasting conservative views on government intrusion via welfare with what he saw as massive intrusion via the justice system. The significant impact of felony disenfranchisement laws, which disproportionately affect African American males, is also highlighted. The cumulative result, the source suggests, is that many African Americans across all social classes develop negative attitudes towards the justice system, often viewing it as fundamentally unfair or arbitrary.
Okay, so beyond potential bias within the system itself, are economic and social disparities also seen as major drivers of the observed crime rate differences?
Definitely. The source emphasizes that racial differences in crime are deeply intertwined with persistent economic and social inequalities. African Americans continue to face higher rates of unemployment, lower average incomes, and greater residential segregation and deprivation compared to whites. These factors, particularly concentrated poverty and lack of opportunity, are strongly linked in research to higher rates of serious crime, especially violent crime like homicide. Economic competition, for instance, can sometimes increase interracial conflict and violence.
And issues related to family structure are mentioned again here too.
Yes, similar to the discussion on class. The source links factors like high unemployment rates for African American males to increased strain on marriages and higher rates of family dissolution. Higher mortality rates among African American males also contribute to a larger proportion of single female-headed households, particularly in disadvantaged communities. The argument is that weakened family structures can sometimes compromise informal social control over youth, and studies have associated divorce and separation rates with homicide rates within the African American community.
The source also seems to circle back to concepts we touched on earlier, like the subculture of violence and relative deprivation, but specifically in the context of race and racism.
It does. It suggests that the historical and ongoing experience of racism and discrimination can contribute to the formation of isolated subcultures, particularly in deeply disadvantaged urban areas, where norms tolerant of violence might develop as a response to perceived powerlessness or disrespect. And the concept of relative deprivation becomes particularly salient when racial inequality means people are constantly comparing their own lack of success or opportunity to that of a more privileged dominant group, leading to frustration that can potentially fuel crime.
Given all these complex factors, bias, inequality, social structure, is convergence in racial crime rates considered possible? Can these gaps close?
The source frames this as a debate, essentially asking, if the underlying economic conditions and social barriers facing minority groups were significantly improved, perhaps through better education, job opportunities, and residential integration, would the observed differences in crime rates eventually disappear? The argument is that convergence is possible if those fundamental economic and social obstacles are removed. It also makes the interesting point that despite the disparities in official crime data and experiences with the justice system, studies show relatively few racial differences today in basic attitudes towards crime and the importance of law and justice.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground here, digging into the major theories explaining crime, the complex and often imperfect methods criminologists use to measure it, UCR and CVS, self-reports, trying to get a handle on those elusive, dark figures of crime. We've looked at the historical trends and the multitude of factors potentially driving them, and explored the intricate patterns of crime linked to geography, time of year, and demographics like age, gender, race, and class, constantly wrestling with those debates about whether the patterns reflect reality or just how we collect the data.
Yeah, a lot to process.
And to bring it all together, the source highlights what it calls one of the most important, maybe game-changing findings in crime statistics over the past several decades, the discovery of the chronic offender.
This really did change the conversation in criminology significantly. The concept of the chronic offender refers to a relatively small group of individuals who are responsible for a vastly disproportionate amount of all criminal activity, especially serious crime.
And this idea was first really solidified and quantified by Marvin Wolfgang's pioneering cohort studies back in Philadelphia.
Exactly. His famous follow-up studies of boys born in Philadelphia in 1945 and later a 1958 cohort were revolutionary. He found that a small percentage of the boys in the cohort, famously dubbed the chronic 6% in his 1945 study, were responsible for over half, 51.9%, of all the recorded police contacts for delinquency generated by the entire group.
Over half the crime from just 6% of the kids. That's truly staggering.
It is, and the numbers were even more striking when you looked at serious violent crimes. That same small group accounted for something like 71% of the homicides, 73% of the rapes, 82% of the robberies, and 69% of the aggravated assaults committed by the entire cohort.
Just an incredible concentration of serious offending in a tiny fraction of the population.
Absolutely. And what was particularly surprising at the time, and deeply challenging to the prevailing theories of deterrence and rehabilitation, was Wolfgang's finding that arrests and court experiences seemed to do little to deter this specific group. In fact, for these chronic offenders in his study, punishment seemed to be inversely related to their continued offending, meaning the more contact they had with the justice system, the more likely they were to reoffend, not less.
Wow. That completely upends the simple idea that punishment stops crime, at least for this specific high-rate group.
It really forced a major rethinking. His later study of a 1958 birth cohort, which was larger and included females, replicated these basic findings about the concentration of offending, although he found that chronic female delinquency was quite rare, only about 1%. And importantly, the existence of this chronic or career offender pattern has been confirmed in numerous other studies conducted in different locations in the U.S. and even internationally since Wolfgang's initial work.
So what predicts someone becoming a chronic offender? Does the source give clues? It mentions early onset problems.
Yes, a key finding is that kids who are exposed to a wide variety of personal and social problems very early in life seem to be at the highest risk for becoming repeat chronic offenders. The source mentions an Orange County study by Schumacher and Kurz that identified a cluster of characteristics that strongly predicted chronic offending. These included significant problems in school, like poor attendance, disruptive behavior, failing grades, serious family problems, like poor parental supervision, conflict, criminal family members, abuse or neglect, early substance abuse, going beyond just experimentation, and establishing a clear pattern of delinquency early on, like frequent stealing, running away, or being a gang member.
So these early problems often snowball and lead to persistence in offending.
That seems to be the pattern. This is the idea of the continuity of crime. The research suggests that the kids who are disruptive, aggressive, and antisocial as early as age 5 or 6 are the ones most likely to exhibit stable, long-term patterns of offending that continue right into adulthood. Follow-up studies of Wolfgang's 1958 cohort by Tracy and Kempf Leonard found that while about 2/3 of the delinquents eventually desisted from crime, those who had started offending very early and had committed serious violent crimes during adolescence were the ones most likely to persist.
So it's not just about starting to commit crime, but about continuing it consistently over a long period. And the source says these chronic offenders don't really specialize. They do a bit of everything.
That's another important finding. They tend to be versatile offenders, engaging in a wide variety of crimes over their careers. Theft, drugs, violence, you name it. They don't just stick to one type of crime. And as noted earlier, apprehension and punishment often seem remarkably ineffective in deterring these specific individuals. The source mentions a study that followed almost 2,000 serious chronic offenders after they were released from the California Youth Authority. These individuals went on to average 22 arrests each over the next decade, with over 90% being rearrested for a whole range of different crimes.
That really drives home that old axiom you sometimes hear. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, especially, it seems, for this small, persistent group.
It really seems to hold true for them, unfortunately, and the discovery of the chronic offender had huge implications for criminology as a field.
It revitalized theory by forcing a new kind of question, didn't it? Not just why people start crime, but why some keep going.
Yes, exactly. It forced criminologists to seriously consider whether chronic offenders might possess different individual traits, maybe biological or psychological, or come from fundamentally different developmental pathways than occasional offenders. This was crucial because most people who live in troubled social conditions or experience adversity do not become chronic criminals. Traditional theories often focus just on the initial causes or onset of crime, treating all offenders somewhat similarly. The chronic offender finding highlighted the absolute need for theories that could explain not just why people start offending, but also why some persist over the life course, and conversely why most eventually stop or desist. It pushed the field towards developing more dynamic, life course-oriented theories.
It feels like we've really unpacked a lot today from just this one chapter. We've journeyed from the foundational theories trying to explain the roots of crime, rational choice, social conflict, developmental pathway, to the nitty-gritty of how criminologists actually try to measure this complex phenomenon, grappling with the limitations of official data like the UCR, the insights and challenges of victim surveys like the NCVS, and the revelations and honesty issues of self-report studies. Each gives us just a piece of that dark figure puzzle.
Different angles on a hidden reality.
We looked at the roller coaster of crime trends over decades and the myriad factors experts debate as drivers, everything from demographics and the economy to policing, media, and even medical technology. We explored the patterns of crime across seasons, regions, and demographics, age, gender, race, class, constantly bumping up against those difficult questions about whether the patterns reflect genuine differences or biases in how we measure and respond to crime.
Yeah, those debates about bias versus behavior run through so many of these demographic patterns.
And we finished by spending time with that really impactful discovery of the chronic offender, that small, persistent group responsible for such a disproportionate amount of harm, forcing theories to evolve beyond just explaining why people start crime to why they continue or why they stop.
So, thinking about all this,
Yeah.
especially the different data sources, each with its known flaws, and the ongoing debates about how factors like police discretion or reporting bias might shape the official statistics. What does that really mean for our ability to ever get a truly accurate, unbiased picture of who is actually committing crime in society?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And if our understanding of who commits crime is potentially skewed by the very data we rely on, how confident can we be in our theories about why crime happens in the first place? It leaves us with this incredibly complex puzzle, and the way we try to solve it has enormous implications not just for criminology, but for social policy, justice reform, and how we try to build safer communities.